So good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is awake. So I'll get started. Growing up, public speaking was one of my greatest fears. I was that stereotypical quiet kid who always hid in the back of the classroom and never wanted to raise my hand. You might be wondering then, how and why am I able to speak to you all right now? Well, like many others with a great fear, I plan on avoiding mine for as long as possible. But a sporadic decision in the 8th grade to try something new forced me to face my fears earlier than I'd expected. It was in the 8th grade that I joined speech and debate, and it was then that my perspective on what failure was changed forever. Today, I want to share with you the story of how I overcame my fear of public speaking and developed a passion for it, despite initially struggling. My story first starts out in the autumn months of 2016, when it was just cold enough for you to start wearing your sweater to school and the leaves had just begun falling. For the past several months, my Wednesday evenings had consisted of political discussions and the images of messy arrows on whiteboards. This Wednesday evening would be the same. I would walk into that classroom, I would greet my coach, and then I would greet my classmates. But there was a twist. This Wednesday evening, I'd finally have to do something that I'd been dreading since the moment I first stepped inside that classroom. And it was to give a 2-minute speech on the nationally set topic that month, which just so happened to be about the Cuban embargo. Now, for many others, a 2-minute speech is really nothing. But for me, standing up and talking for 2 minutes was like an immense and an impossible challenge. The fact that the speech was impromptu already freaked me out. But what freaked me out even more was that this would be an exposition round, or one in front of all of my classmates. Yet on that day, by some force of will, I dragged myself up there and I sat down, facing what seemed like an endless row of people. The debate started, and throughout the entire first half of the round, I was pretty much distracted. The voices and the words of my opponents were flying right past my head, and my eyes were shifting around aimlessly. It was only after an awkward silence and a nudge on my knee that I knew it was my turn to start speaking. So I stood up, knees shaking, I looked down at my flow, and I pressed the start button on my timer, propelling myself into what I thought was uncharted territory. Yet, the more I stood up there, the more disoriented I became. I was trying to say something about the Cuban embargo, but then what was the Cuban embargo? Why was it even important? The complex ideas in my head were coming out as incoherent jumbles of words, and I was frustrated. Yet there was nothing I could do about it. And at that moment, I cared more about how my classmates perceived the words that came out of my mouth than how much I was actually learning or gaining from that experience. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a student laughing. Were they laughing at me? Had I said something wrong? What did I even say wrong? And before I knew it, the feeling that many are too familiar with overtook me. Sweaty palms and shaky hands. But there was something unexpected, and that was tears. Tears of humiliation, and in front of my entire class. At that moment, my embarrassment boiled over, and I did the one thing that I didn't want to do that day, which was to run away. And to this day, I can still hear the sound of my classmates' laughter as I ran out of that room. Now that situation is pretty traumatic. And in today's society, we'd characterize what happened in my very first debate round as an epic failure, or a fat L. Which is why it might be surprising to some of you that I actually attribute that experience to being the reason behind why I enjoy speech and debate so much today. To be fair, at that time, I also thought it was an epic failure. And when I had worked up enough courage to even step back inside that classroom, I merely hid in the back like I had, growing up, invisible, and wishing that I could disappear. In fact, it took me about a good week before I could even look back into the eyes of my coach and my classmates again. Yet after that initial shame and embarrassment wore off, something extraordinary happened. In the following rounds, I became more daring, saying things I normally would not have said even if someone paid me $1 million to. And I became more assertive. I wouldn't let others speak over me during crossfire, and if I had something to say, I would say it. Now, how could this even happen? It seemed like my failure was strangely liberating, and that my fear was almost all but gone. It seems crazy, but as I delved deeper into the relationship between fear and failure, things began to make more sense. Fear and failure are closely intertwined. It was then that I realized that my fear of public speaking wasn't actually a fear of public speaking, but a fear of failing at it. There's actually a term for fear of failure, and that's aticophobia, which, according to many medical professionals, is the reason why so many people lead a confined lifestyle. Now, in the context of my story, the reason why I feared public speaking wasn't because I didn't like people or I didn't like to talk to people, but it was because I was afraid that I would fail and embarrass myself. But experiencing that failure that I feared so much changed everything. Before I had gone through that experience, I thought of failing as falling into a deep, dark hole, one that you would never be able to get out of. But after going through that experience, I realized that failure is more like having an extra set of stairs that you have to climb before you reach your goal. And if you view failure from this perspective, then there's no actual reason to fear it. As long as you can and you're willing to climb up those extra set of stairs, you'll eventually be able to get where you want to. So, in the following weeks after my meltdown, I went back into the classroom, I tried again, I started, and most importantly, I learned. And my classmates and my coach slowly began to forget about what had happened, and things began to look up. However, if you never once go through such an experience or experience failure, then failure will forever remain as that dark and scary monster that looms over you and the rest of the decisions you make in your lifetime. Sometimes I even use this failure isn't that bad thinking to empower myself. I think, well, if I was able to make it out of a round where I was crying and still come back and try again, then I should have no reason to fear failing in the future. However, there are still situations today where I'm uncomfortable, and that's okay. For example, a couple of weeks ago when I went to a debate tournament, I still got a little nervous before I stood up to deliver my speech to a judge, or a little bit disheveled when I was battling against particularly tough opponents during crossfire. Even a couple minutes ago, before I stepped onto this stage, I was feeling that familiar throb of nervousness. But what's most important is to realize that if you're able to take that initial leap and get over that initial fear, then you can and you will be able to continue. Now, why does this even matter, and how is it relevant to real life? Well, in real life, we encounter the possibility of failure everywhere, whether it be a job interview, sports team tryout, maybe even a test grade. What I want you to do is to embrace that possibility instead of escaping from it. View failure in a different light. Instead of strictly categorizing everything as either a success or a fail, view failure as a sort of middle ground or an opportunity to improve. And I know that since most of you have just entered high school, you probably feel pressure in one form or another to excel at an academic, an extracurricular, or both. But what I want you to do and what I want you to know is that it's okay if you don't excel at something or anything. Most importantly, instead of beating yourself up, you should channel that energy into improvement and growth. And look at the bigger picture. Debate is one of my favorite activities today. Through it, I've met countless people from around the world. I've gone through some crazy experiences, and I've learned so much more than I could have ever imagined when I first started. I have the privilege of leading the Amador Valley debate team and guiding the novices through the challenges that I first encountered when I was younger. But most importantly, what I realized is that I wouldn't be standing here today if I hadn't failed in my very first round. Thank you.